I just wanted to swing in and see if I could clarify a couple of things about the Russia chapter. I'd had a couple of questions and things like that. So we'll just see what we can do to help clarify some stuff. I hope you're all doing really well. The sun is out and it's turning into a really nice spring, but rumor has it it's supposed to snow this weekend. So good times, gotta love Missouri. So anyway, about the Russia chapter, there were a couple of things that a few people have asked about. So I'll jump in here and show you the things that I think are important. So ignore that right quick. There we go. This is the first one, just for kicks. This is Russia, and of course you recognize the little purple thing on this slide. That is Missouri. I show you this in order to sort of drive home how big of a space we're actually dealing with when we're dealing with Russia and the near abroad. This is just the country of Russia. This doesn't even include the near abroad. Missouri is a little over 69,000 square miles, and Russia is over 6.6 million square miles. So as you can see, you can put a lot of Missouris in Russia. So that's free with the class. The population of Russia is actually a little over a third of the population of the United States, and disproportionately, they all tend to live over here on this side of the Ural Mountains. They're heavily concentrated in these more temperate regions. But anyway, there you go. That's free with the class. The other thing I wanted to show you just for fun, yeah, if you want to make one of these, you can do comparison maps with anything you want to at mapfight.appspot.com. It's actually really fun. So if you've ever wanted to know if Belgium is actually larger or smaller than Lake Superior, it's a really good place to go and look up that kind of information. It can be super fun. So I wanted to show you this too, just because when we look at physical geography, sometimes what you look at is culture. And, you know, in the United States, we have the Statue of Liberty. Well, this is the Motherland Calls. See this stunning, gigantic statue with her sword extended out behind her. So if you can imagine trying to construct that out of stone and actually balance it so this big, heavy sword doesn't tip her over, it's quite a feat of engineering. She was actually constructed to commemorate the Battle of Stalingrad. Over 3.5 million Russian people lose their lives, soldiers and civilians combined, in the Battle of Stalingrad. It was besieged for over 200 days. And so this Motherland Calls has become sort of a central symbol of Russian spirit in kind of the same way that the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of the United States. So I wanted to show you her partly just because she's awesome, but also to sort of drive home there are a lot of similarities actually between Russia and the United States, especially in terms of our symbology. But there is the Statue of Liberty and the Motherland Calls in a side-by-side comparison. One thing I will point out here, people like to argue about which one of these is actually bigger or how much bigger one is than the other. Notice that we're measuring from the top of their platforms. So the Statue of Liberty sits in New York Harbor, and she's actually on a really tall platform. So if you measure from the platform to the top of the statue, you get a very different result than if you measure the platform along with the statue. But anyway, there you go. That's free with the class. That's the Motherland Calls. So what I really wanted to get to, though, was this concept of misdevelopment. I think it was throwing a lot of people off. So as you followed through in the book, what makes the near abroad is that it was closely associated with Russia, and typically there were members of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, during the Cold War. And so as that collapsed, one of the things that we ran into was that command economy, the idea that there is one central government office, Gosplan, that tells everybody what to produce and when to produce it and how much of it to produce, isn't something you can let go of really quickly without creating some trauma in a country. And so what we're going to look at today is how that affects the demographics of Russia. So first of all, as I'm sure you remember from reading the chapter, when the USSR fell and Gorbachev resigned, Boris Yeltsin is going to become the head of Russia, and he is going to introduce what's called economic shock therapy, which was intended to be a rapid-fire transition from that rigidly controlled economy to a fully privatized economy. And I think the tricky thing about that, if you think about having absolutely everything controlled for you, and then think about having absolutely no control asserted over you, then, you know, I mean, there is a certain age where a lot of us are just not ready to be self-directing without any practice, right? Well, that's where the Russian economy was. So 1992, the USSR collapses, and look what happens to their industrial output for the next few years. The Russian economy tanks, in essence. So how people respond to that demographically is kind of interesting. So I'm going to bounce over here and show you this really quickly. Now, you remember we've seen population pyramid after population pyramid. This one is not normal. So you remember we have basically our four shapes. Let me see if I can grab a pen here. We've got the collapsing sides population pyramid, that's a stage 1. And we've got the straight sides population pyramid, and that's a stage 2. Then we got the kind of straight up and downish, and it's a stage 3. A lot of people look at this Russian one and they think what they're looking at is actually collapsing sides like a stage 4. The important thing to notice about a stage 4 to know this is look how big and robust the top is in a stage 4, but look what's going on at the top of Russia. So this is not a stage 4 post-industrial demographic pattern at all. This population pyramid from Russia in 2015 is actually showing us something highly unusual, and it is what we call misdevelopment. Because what's happening is actually death rates are quite high, and that's why we see shrinkage at the top of the pyramid, but birth rates are quite low, and so we see shrinkage also at the bottom of the pyramid. And so people call this the Russian cross because it's wide in the middle where there are middle-aged people, like people my age, people your parents' age, but it's sort of skinny at the top and the bottom, high death rates, low birth rates. This is not a normal part of the demographic transition model. This is actually highly unusual. And what we see is this tripped off. This started happening in Russia at exactly the same time that the USSR collapsed and the economy started to collapse. And so this leads us to some really interesting questions. Normally, poor countries have high birth rates and wealthy countries have low birth rates. Well, Russia, before the fall of the USSR, was actually an industrial country. They industrialized really fast. I grew up during the Cold War. I was not supposed to say nice things about Russia when I was growing up. Russians were always the bad guys in movies and things like that. It's really kind of a different time in the United States. But one thing that I think we can admit today is these guys went from being effectively pre-industrial to early transitional at World War I to being fully industrial, manufacturing tanks, manufacturing ships, manufacturing trucks during World War II. So they made up a lot of ground really fast, and they were a clear stage 3 industrial economy before the collapse of the USSR. But then what happens is actually really interesting. Birth rates bottom out. And when those birth rates bottom out, people just become nervous about having families. And so they have fewer and fewer children. So we see here the child generation is actually much smaller than the parent generation here. But at the same time, death rates are going to go way up. The life expectancy right now in Russia for a man is 55 years. Guys, that's really young. In the United States, that number is more like 78 years. So considering that these were two countries that were kind of on the same path, roughly, demographically, economically, in the 1990s, excuse me, that's a serious change. So what we're going to bounce forward, let me get rid of my marker here and see if we can bounce forward and I can show you what happened. So 1962, Russian life expectancy was pretty high, just under 70. But what happens is as we approach the collapse of the USSR, that happens right here. Look what happens to life expectancy. It collapses way down. Whoop, made that go away. Let's go back. There we go. And it's starting to recover now. But even now, the life expectancy for men in Russia especially is still much lower than this average. And you can see that actually reflected over here too. Look at this population pyramid. Even though, normally women do live a little bit longer than men. That just is a thing. Why that is, different people theorize about differently. But it's the case actually in other than human mammal populations as well. Among dogs, among horses, among mice, females just have a little bit longer life expectancy. So normally you're going to expect the female side of this pyramid to be a little bit larger anyway. But what's happening here, where the female side is drastically larger than the male side, this is highly unusual. So first thing I'm going to do is take your textbook author to task, because he says this really outrageous and absurd thing that I want to make sure that we deal with just a little bit. So this is a 2015 population pyramid, right? So Dr. Hobbs says, well, a lot of men died in World War II, and that caused this collapse. So let's just test that. So first of all, most of the Russians who died in World War II were not soldiers, they were civilians, which come in female as well as male deaths in roughly equal proportion. So first of all, he's mistaken there. But more importantly, I think he just kept that phrase from an analysis that maybe he did back in the 60s or the 70s, because World War II, you remember, is going to end in Russia in 1945. So 1945 to the present is 75 years, right? So even if we say until 2015, because that's where this population pyramid is from, we're still looking at 70 years ago, which means even if you were 10 years old and you were a male who was fighting in World War II at 10 years old, you would be all the way up here in these brackets on this population pyramid. But as we can see, that disparity, that unevenness, anybody who is under 80 really is not eligible to have died in World War II. You know, just, I mean, as a civilian casualty, sure, but for these to be soldier deaths, they need to be above this line. So if that was true, the rest of this would not also show this profound disparity in size, but it does. Every age group that we look at, we see, until we get down here to the 30s, actually, we see females profoundly outnumbering males. But look at this. It's clearly not a reflection of the birth rate, because look at our youngest generations. Slightly more boys than girls. Over here, slightly more boys than girls. Over here, slightly more boys than girls. So we start out with more males, and these appalling death rates are going to lead us to a place where we see this kind of asymmetry by about the mid-30s. So there you go. That's me taking the textbook author to task just a little bit. This is clearly not World War II, because if it was World War II, that unevenness would stop somewhere around here. These are not soldiers' deaths, not even child soldiers' deaths creating this statistic. It's actually something else. So in the meantime, we've looked at life expectancy here. We're going to jump forward and look at one more thing. This is the Russian Federation in 2019. This is 4 years newer than the data that was in your book. So I thought it was worth just looking at this, because you may have noticed this is getting better. You know, birth rates collapsed pretty hard right after the fall of the USSR, but it's starting to expand again. So 5 years after that last data was collected, what we can see is we're still seeing small expansion of the birth rate in Russia. It is starting to restabilize again. Anyway, this concept of a rising death rate is what makes this stage of the demographic transition model so unusual. So when you see a normal passage from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, you remember stage 1, high birth rate, high death rate. Stage 2, the first thing that happens is actually that death rates go down. And death rates, if you revisit that diagram of the demographic transition model in chapter 3, death rates don't go back up again. Death rates, once they go down at the end of stage 2, don't typically move. So what's made Russia's situation so unusual, what makes this Russian cross situation where we're thin at the top and we're thin at the bottom and we're widest in the middle, what makes that unusual is death rates going up. So this is not post-industrialism. This is not a wealthy, content, tertiary sector economy. What we're looking at here is misdevelopment. So effectively what has happened is Russia's birth rate progressed forward from stage 3 to stage 4. It got even lower. But the death rate did not progress forward. The death rate reverted backwards to stage 1. Sorry, my finger's getting out of the camera shot there. Reverted backwards to stage 1. So this is why it's called misdevelopment. This is not any stage of the demographic transition model. Okay, so low births, high deaths, does not exist in that natural demographic transition model. So hopefully that helps you make a little bit of sense on what's going on with that population pyramid. I know your book talks about it, but maybe just having a little bit face-to-face explanation can help you. The other thing I want to show you really quickly was this. Substance abuse and its relationship to misdevelopment is actually really interesting. So there are about 144 million people in Russia. About 20 million of them are classified as alcoholics. Alcohol is consumed regularly and socially in Russia. I know in the Bible Belt, we think of religion and alcohol as just being fundamentally opposed to each other. But the thing is, in Russia, the most common version of the Christian faith is Orthodox Christianity. And Orthodoxy actually allows alcohol. Orthodoxy is fine with alcohol. Orthodoxy is fine with the clergy marrying. We've got lots of interesting stuff going on. So the religious profile of Russia does not impede alcohol consumption at all. And there's not any social sense that you're doing anything inappropriate when you drink. So 20 million. A seventh of the population in Russia are classified as alcoholics. That's drastic, y'all. So 25% of Russian men are going to die before they reach the age of 55. That's what makes that population pyramid so lopsided, where the male side is so much smaller than the female side, because that high death rate among Russian men. Men and women both drink in Russia, but disproportionately, it tends to be more a male habit than a female habit. So the per capita consumption statistic, just for kicks, is 13 liters of pure alcohol per capita. That's not beer and wine. That's not the light stuff. That is heavy, pure, 200 proof alcohol. Whether it's consumed in beer or in vodka or in brandy, hard liquor tends to be the beverage of choice though. So this is a long-standing problem in Russia, and it's one that actually government has never really wanted to intervene with until fairly recently. And the reason for that's actually super interesting. Ivan the Great began taxing alcohol and taxing taverns way back in the 1600s. And Ivan the Terrible actually got a government monopoly on alcohol. So every time you bought alcohol, basically it was the government that was making the profit. So what an interesting thing to do for a country that they monopolize this one industry. And as a result, they've always got people's money flowing into their coffers. So by the mid 1600s, 1/3 of Russian men actually owed debts to their local taverns. They had drank more than they had paid for. And so their paychecks, they were always just making payments back to the local tavern. So what an interesting taxation strategy, right? So the result of this, though, Peter the Great actually at one point was supposed to have said that the most patriotic thing that a person could do for Russia was to go have a drink. There were laws passed that actually would have women flogged if they went into taverns to bring their husbands home, because there was a direct benefit, a direct financial benefit to having men drink alcohol. So that's kind of difficult when you look to how you're going to control this problem and you recognize that government is actually trying to facilitate this problem because they make a profit off of it. You know, money is a tricky thing. It makes people do stuff. So that's actually, we're going to see that a really kind of moment of pivot in 1985 when Gorbachev introduces what he calls the war on alcoholism. And he's going to impose some basic rules. He says, we're not going to sell alcohol before lunchtime. And we're going to stop selling alcohol at 10 o'clock at night. Trying some little stuff to just curtail the consumption a little bit. And, you know, would the war on alcoholism have worked? It's tough to say. But the USSR is going to enter into just a downward spiral and a collapse so shortly after this that we really don't know the result. So today, on the free market, alcohol is still widely consumed in Russia, and alcoholism does lead to a large number of premature deaths, especially among Russian men. In the meantime, drug use, illegal drug use, is a parallel problem for Russian people. It's difficult to calculate how many people are using illegal drugs in Russia because the thing is they are illegal. And so a lot of people don't want to admit it, even if they do have a drug problem. And I'm sure that that's something you can probably comprehend. I think the United States has this as well, that people who use probably don't want the world to know that about them. So estimates place drug users, regular drug users, between 7.8 and 12 million in Russia, and they have the highest concentration of injecting drug users, like heroin especially, but other injecting drugs as well, in the world at 1.8 million conservatively estimated. Of those injecting drug users, 1/3 of them are HIV positive. And the thing about injectable drugs, the reason that we tend to see so much spread of HIV is because people tend to share needles. And so that sharing of hypodermic needles so that multiple people can inject themselves out of one prepared syringe is a serious problem. And then 90% of that 1.8 million people have hepatitis C, which can also be spread through dirty needles. Hepatitis C destroys your liver, in essence. And most people who have it don't know that they have it. They've never had it diagnosed, but it can kill you. So these are a couple of the problems that are significantly contributing right now to that high death rate in Russia. And this interesting thing that has happened that brings us to that population pyramid again, let me bounce back to it for a second, is normally a rich country is going to have low birth rates and a poor country is going to have high birth rates. But where Russia is not either rich or poor exactly. It was rich. When people my age were children, they grew up in a fairly affluent Russia. They may not have been comfortable there, but they had a good time. So this is not necessarily a Russia that has transitioned to being poor per se. Rather, it has just collapsed. It's entered a period of instability. So birth rates have not responded the way that they would to poverty, because poor countries tend to see an increase in birth rates. And instead, what we're seeing is this phase of misdevelopment where people just don't have children. So the last thing I was going to show you, and partly just because as a geographer, I find lots of maps really interesting. This map shows you the liters of alcohol consumed per capita all over the world. And what you'll notice is Russia is a high flyer over here. Russia, being one of the darker countries on the map, is actually consuming a great deal of alcohol at 13 liters per capita per year. But look over here at the United States. The Bible Belt, we Southern Baptists over here are just not able to accomplish an impact on the statistics like maybe we would like to. If we saw this on a county by county level, we would be able to discern the Bible Belt. But as a country, you don't really see that impact. One thing that you do immediately recognize here, though, is the spread of Islam. So we're going to talk about that more when we get to chapter 6. But the Islamic world says you don't drink alcohol. Islam is actually really down on booze. So, booze. Anyway, so you can see very well the range of Islam. A lot of you may not have realized Indonesia over here is actually the largest Islamic population in the world. Very low alcohol consumption, all the way through India, which is Hindu/Muslim, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and all of northern Africa, where we see the range of Islam. We also see a collapse in alcohol consumption. Those don't seem like they would be directly related, but this is what makes mapping things so incredibly interesting. So that's all I have for you today. I hope it helps you make sense of misdevelopment and what you're actually seeing in that Russian population pyramid. So until next time, shoot me an email if you need anything, and I'll see you around. Bye.